test begins.
This video just reviews the key red headings in Chapter 15 from a continuity and change over time standpoint. So the first red heading, Europeans and Asian commerce. I have a change of increasing European presence in Asian trade. So in the early 1500s, remember Portugal with Vasco da Gama finds a route around the tip of Africa. And in the early 1500s, they're establishing these trading post empires right here. They haven't taken over the whole continent, they're just establishing control over key ports that help them to have more influence over Indian Ocean trade. By the middle, we have the Spanish control of the Philippines. So in response to Portugal's route around Africa, the Spanish, if you can imagine Spain up here, send explorers, starting with Columbus, to the west. And Magellan finds a route around the tip of South America and ends up finding the Philippines. And Spain takes over the entire area of the Philippines and establishes a colony. So by the end, in addition to the Portuguese trading post empires and Spanish control of the Philippines, we have the Dutch and British East India companies. In what is now Indonesia, the Dutch establish their colony, and the British are going to establish a trading company with India and eventually conquer the Mughal Empire and take it over entirely. So that's why I have a change in increasing European presence in Asian trade. It's important to note that the Europeans don't totally control Asian trade. China is still very significant, for instance, so it's not that the Europeans have kicked China out or anything, which is why I just have a description here of increasing European presence. The next heading is about the silver trade, and my change is the development of global trade networks. So at the beginning of this time period in 1450, we have regional trade networks. We have the Silk Roads operating, we have the Trans-Saharan trade network, there's certainly trade on the Indian Ocean, but by the middle, with the discovery of silver, in what is now Bolivia and Potosi, which is a Spanish colony, and also simultaneously in Japan, we have silver becoming an important global currency, and that's because China, about the same time, passed a law that its citizens had to pay taxes in silver. So merchants who had sold goods like silk or porcelain to foreign traders are now going to demand payment in silver so that they can pay their taxes in China, and this is why China is a leader in the development of the silver trade. So a European merchant who wants to buy silks in China and bring them back to Europe by any route, overland, but most likely through these Asian maritime trade routes that the Europeans are developing, that European merchant has to purchase those goods in silver, which is why by the end of the time period we have a global silver trade. And this map here with these red arrows is showing the direction of the flow of silver. The next heading is about the fur trade, and for this one I decided to focus on environmental impact of that trade, which is why I'm describing it as a continuity, which is the diminishing of animal populations. In Europe, beginning in 1500, the population went up, and there was also something that we call the Little Ice Age, which was a period of cooling temperatures. So more people and colder temperatures creates a larger demand for fur, and in Europe, the supply of fur animals was severely diminished, which is what caused Europeans to look for other sources of fur to meet this demand. So we have the North American fur trade resulting in a diminishing of the beaver population, and that's what this map is showing, the participation of European nations in the North American fur trade. And by the end, in Russia, the same process is happening. The fur-bearing animal in Russia is called the sable, and so that's why it's a continuity, that demand for furs is having this environmental impact. And then finally, we have the Atlantic slave trade, which is also a continuity. In the beginning of the time period that I have on my slide here, around 1500, Portugal is conducting raids in concert with their trips around Africa. They are raiding the coastal areas of West Africa and seizing slaves. By the middle of the time period, Europeans realized that there are African nations who are willing to trade with Europeans directly for slaves. Remember that in West Africa, as in many parts of the world, there was a tradition of taking prisoners of war and using them as slaves. So with the participation of African states in the slave trade, keep in mind that they're not selling their own citizens. They're selling prisoners of war that they had already taken into slavery. And I have as my ending piece of evidence an example of a state that is making that cooperative arrangement with the Europeans. That is Dahomey. And remember that in the textbook, there is a contrast with Benin as a state that resisted participation in the slave trade. It's also important to note that the vast majority of slaves from West Africa were taken to Brazil and also to the Caribbean. About 80 to 90% of West African slaves, their final destination was those two places. On this map, the thickness of the line is based on how many slaves were taken to various places. So for our experience here in North America, you can see it was about 5 or 6% or so. You can see how small this line is. Just something to keep in mind. There's also a reminder on this map that there are other slave trade routes in addition to the transatlantic, and we have slavery going across the trans-Saharan trade network and then also along the Indian Ocean trade. The last slide here is an opportunity to practice synthesis. So that's a quick overview of continuity and change over time for this chapter.